There's something deeply unsettling about abandoned hospitals. These places that once held so much life, so much hope and despair, now stand empty, decaying monuments to human suffering. Tonight, I'm sharing 5 true stories from people who dared to explore these forgotten medical facilities. What they found inside will make you question whether some places are truly ever empty. Story 1. The Night Shift That Never Ended. My name is Marcus, and I'm a photographer who specializes in abandoned places. 3 years ago, I decided to explore Riverside General Hospital in Ohio. The place had been closed for nearly a decade after multiple patient deaths and financial troubles. I arrived around 10 p.m. on a cold October night. The building was massive, 7 stories of crumbling brick and broken windows. Most of the glass had been boarded up, but I'd done my research and knew about a loading dock entrance that was usually left unsecured. The moment I stepped inside, the smell hit me. It wasn't just mold and dust like most abandoned buildings. There was something else, something medicinal and sharp that made my eyes water. The emergency lighting was still partially functioning, casting these weird, flickering shadows down the hallway. I made my way to the main floor first, my footsteps echoing despite trying to walk quietly. The reception area was a mess, papers scattered everywhere, wheelchairs overturned. But what caught my attention were the whiteboards on the wall. They still had patient information written on them, names and room numbers in faded marker. That's when I heard it. A soft beeping sound, like a heart monitor. It was coming from somewhere deeper in the building. Now, I knew the power had been cut years ago. The only electricity was from the emergency backup system, and that definitely wasn't connected to medical equipment. But there it was, that steady, rhythmic beeping. I followed the sound through the maze of corridors, past empty nursing stations and rooms filled with abandoned medical equipment. The beeping was getting louder, more distinct. My heart was racing, but I told myself it had to be some kind of battery-powered device that hadn't died yet. I reached the cardiac wing on the 3rd floor, and the sound was definitely coming from room 314. The door was slightly open, and pale light was spilling out into the hallway. I pushed it open slowly, my camera ready. The room was empty except for a single hospital bed and an old heart monitor. The screen was green and glowing, showing a steady heartbeat pattern. But here's the thing that made my blood run cold. The monitor wasn't connected to anything. No patient, no power cord, nothing. As I stood there staring at this impossible machine, the beeping suddenly stopped. The screen went dark. Then, in the silence, I heard something that made every hair on my body stand up. Breathing. Slow, labored breathing coming from the bed. I looked at the bed, and I swear I could see the outline of a person under the sheets, the fabric rising and falling with each breath. But when I shone my flashlight directly on it, there was nothing there. Just an empty bed with rumpled sheets. I backed out of the room slowly, my hands shaking. As I reached the doorway, the heart monitor suddenly came back to life. Beep, beep, beep. But now the rhythm was different. I ran. I don't care how that sounds, but I ran through those hallways like something was chasing me. And maybe something was, because I could hear footsteps behind me, keeping pace with mine. When I'd stop, they'd stop. When I'd start again, they'd start again. I made it to my car and didn't look back. When I got home and reviewed my photos, most of them were too blurry to use. But there was one from room 314 that I'll never forget. In the background, barely visible, there's a shadow next to the bed. A shadow in the shape of a person. I never went back to Riverside General. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear that beeping in my dreams.
Story 2. The Pediatric Ward Discovery. I'm Sarah, and I used to be part of an urban exploration group in Michigan. We'd heard about Mercy Children's Hospital, which had been abandoned for about 15 years after a terrible fire in the pediatric ward. The fire had killed several children, and the hospital never recovered from the tragedy. We decided to check it out on a Saturday afternoon in early spring. There were 4 of us, me, my boyfriend Jake, and 2 friends, Alex and Mia. We thought going during the day would be safer, less creepy. We were wrong. The children's section was on the 2nd floor, and that's where we headed first. The hallways were painted with these cheerful cartoon characters that had faded and peeled over the years. It was heartbreaking, really, seeing Mickey Mouse and Winnie the Pooh covered in soot and decay. We split up to cover more ground, which I know was stupid, but we'd done this dozens of times before without any problems. I went with Mia toward the playroom while Jake and Alex checked out the patient rooms. The playroom was the saddest thing I'd ever seen. Toys were scattered everywhere, covered in dust and debris from the damaged ceiling. There was a rocking horse in the corner that was slowly moving back and forth, even though there was no wind. Mia was taking pictures of some stuffed animals when we heard it. Children laughing. It was faint at first, like it was coming from far away, but it was definitely the sound of kids playing. We looked at each other, both thinking the same thing. Maybe there were homeless people squatting in the building, maybe they had children with them. We called out to Jake and Alex, but got no response. The laughter was getting closer, and now we could hear footsteps running through the halls. Light, quick footsteps like children running around during recess. But here's what made it truly terrifying. We could see the footprints. Dusty little footprints appeared on the floor, moving past us like invisible children were running by. The prints were small, maybe from kids aged 5 to 10. They left a trail through the dust, circling around us, then heading toward the patient rooms. Mia grabbed my arm, and I could feel her shaking. We followed the footprints, calling out for Jake and Alex. The trail led us to a room at the end of the hall, room 237. The door was closed, but we could hear voices inside. Children's voices, singing a nursery rhyme. Ring around the rosy, pocket full of posies, ashes, ashes, we all fall down. The singing stopped abruptly when we reached the door. I knocked and called out, "Jake? Alex? Are you in there?" No response. I tried the handle, but the door was locked from the inside. That was impossible. These old hospital room doors didn't have locks that could be engaged from inside. Then we heard Jake's voice, but it sounded strange, distant. "Sarah? We're in here, but we can't get out. The door won't open." I tried the handle again, pushing and pulling, but it wouldn't budge. Mia was using her phone's flashlight to look through the small window in the door. What she saw made her scream. Jake and Alex were sitting in the room, but they weren't alone. There were children with them, lots of children, sitting in a circle on the floor. But these weren't living children. They were translucent, like looking at someone through water, and they were all holding hands. The children turned to look at us through the window, and their faces were burned, scarred and melted from the fire that had taken their lives years ago. That's when the door suddenly swung open, and Jake and Alex stumbled out. They were pale, sweating, and completely terrified. Jake kept saying, they just wanted to play. They kept asking us to play with them. We ran from that hospital and never went back. But Jake was never the same after that day. He'd wake up at night saying he could hear children calling his name, asking him to come back and play. He moved across the country 6 months later, said he needed to get as far away as possible. The strange thing is, when we looked up the history of the fire, we found out that room 237 was where most of the children had been trapped. 7 kids died in that room, waiting for someone to save them. Maybe they're still waiting.
Story 3. The Surgery That Never Stopped. My name is David, and I work in hospital maintenance. Because of my job, I'm not easily spooked by medical equipment or the atmosphere of hospitals. But what happened at St. Mary's Medical Center changed everything I thought I knew about abandoned places. St. Mary's had been closed for 2 years after losing their accreditation. The building was scheduled for demolition, but the city was taking their time with permits. A security company hired me to check the building systems before they shut off the remaining utilities. I was there on a Thursday morning in November, gray and drizzly outside. Perfect weather for exploring a dead hospital. My job was to document which systems were still functional and identify any potential hazards. I started in the basement with the utilities, then worked my way up floor by floor. Everything seemed normal until I reached the surgical wing on the 4th floor. That's where things got weird. The double doors to the surgical suite were propped open, which was odd because I'd been told all the doors were supposed to be sealed. I could see the main operating room through the observation window, and all the lights were on. Bright, white surgical lights illuminating an empty operating table. Now, I knew the power to this section had been cut months ago. I'd checked the electrical panels myself. But there those lights were, burning bright as day. I went inside to investigate. The operating room was pristine, like it had been cleaned and prepared for surgery. All the instruments were laid out on trays, the monitors were humming softly, and there was even classical music playing from somewhere. I stood there trying to figure out how any of this was possible when I heard voices from the adjacent prep room. Medical professionals discussing a procedure, using all the right terminology. I thought maybe squatters had somehow restored power to this section. I called out, "Hello? Building maintenance. I need to speak with whoever's in charge here." The voices stopped immediately. Dead silence. I walked toward the prep room, but it was empty. No one there, but the surgical gowns hanging on the hooks were swaying slightly, like people had just taken them off and left. That's when I noticed the surgery schedule board on the wall. It showed operations planned for that day, complete with patient names, surgeons, and procedure types. But the dates were all from 2 years ago, right before the hospital closed. I was taking pictures with my phone when the operating room lights suddenly dimmed to a soft blue. The monitors started beeping, showing vital signs for a patient who wasn't there. Heart rate, blood pressure, oxygen levels, all displaying on the screens. Then I heard the most terrifying sound of my life. Someone was being wheeled into the operating room on a gurney. I could hear the wheels squeaking, the metal clattering, people giving instructions. Patient is prepped for surgery. Anesthesia is ready. Scalpel. We're losing him. Blood pressure is dropping. But when I looked into the operating room, it was still empty. Just that table under the surgical lights. Yet I could hear everything happening. A full surgical procedure being performed by people I couldn't see on a patient who wasn't there. The phantom surgery continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. I heard every sound, the beeping monitors, the surgical instruments clinking together, urgent whispers between medical staff. Then, suddenly, a long, flat beep. The sound that means a patient has died. Time of death, 11:47 a.m. Everything went silent. The monitors shut off, the lights dimmed, even the classical music stopped. I looked at my phone. It was exactly 11:47 a.m. I left that building immediately and called my supervisor. Told him the electrical systems were more damaged than we thought and recommended they expedite the demolition. Later, I did some research on St. Mary's final days. Turns out, the last surgery performed there before it closed was on November 15th, 2 years ago. A heart operation that went wrong. The patient died at 11:47 a.m. I was there on November 15th, exactly 2 years later, at exactly the same time. Some operations, I guess, never really end.
Story 4. The Patient Who Wouldn't Leave. I'm Amanda, and I used to be a nurse before I got into urban photography. That medical background made me feel more comfortable exploring abandoned hospitals than most people would. I thought I understood these places, knew what to expect. Hillcrest Psychiatric Hospital proved me very wrong. Hillcrest had been closed for 8 years after numerous patient abuse scandals. The place had a dark history even before it shut down, reports of patients being mistreated, mysterious deaths, and experimental procedures. I'd been wanting to photograph it for months. I went alone on a Sunday evening in February. Snow was falling lightly, and the temperature was dropping fast. The hospital was a sprawling complex of connected buildings, most of them in various stages of decay. I started with the main administration building, then moved to the patient housing wings. The psychiatric wards were disturbing, even empty, rooms with padded walls, restraint devices still attached to beds, and medication charts yellowed with age. I was on the 3rd floor of the East Wing when I first heard her. A woman's voice, soft and sad, singing an old lullaby. The melody echoed through the empty hallways, bouncing off the walls in a way that made it impossible to tell where it was coming from. Following the sound, I found myself in what used to be the long-term care section. These were rooms for patients who had been hospitalized for years, sometimes decades. Many of the doors still had nameplates, even though they were faded and hard to read. The singing was coming from room 318. The nameplate read E. Morrison, admitted 1987. I looked through the small window in the door and saw something that made my blood freeze. There was a woman sitting on the bed, wearing a faded hospital gown. She was elderly, maybe in her 70s, with long gray hair that hung loose around her shoulders. She was rocking back and forth, singing that same lullaby over and over. My first thought was that she was a homeless person who had found shelter in the hospital. But something about the scene felt wrong. The way she sat so perfectly still except for that gentle rocking, the way the moonlight seemed to pass right through her. I knocked on the door gently. "Ma'am, are you okay?" She stopped singing and turned to look at me. Her eyes were completely white, no pupils, no iris, just milky white. And when she smiled, I could see right through her to the wall behind. "The doctors said I could go home tomorrow," she said in a voice like rustling paper. "They promised I could go home tomorrow. But tomorrow never comes, does it?" I backed away from the door, my hands shaking. This was impossible. But she kept talking, and I could hear every word clearly. "I've been waiting so long. 43 years, 2 months, and 16 days. I counted every single one. But they won't let me leave. They say I'm not ready yet." I looked at the admission date on her nameplate again, 1987. That was over 35 years ago, not 43. Unless she'd been there even before that nameplate was made. "What's your name?" I asked, though I'm not sure why. "Eleanor. Eleanor Morrison." I was supposed to get better and go home to my daughter. She was only 7 when they brought me here. Do you know how old she is now? I did the math in my head. If Eleanor had been here for over 40 years, and her daughter was 7 when she was admitted, that would make her daughter nearly 50 years old now. "She must be grown up now," I said softly. Eleanor's expression changed, became angry and desperate. "No, she's still 7. She's still waiting for Mommy to come home. I have to get out of here. I have to find her." The door to her room suddenly swung open, even though I hadn't touched the handle. Eleanor stood up from the bed, and I could see that her feet didn't quite touch the floor. She moved toward me, gliding rather than walking. "You can help me leave, can't you? You're not one of the doctors. They won't let me go, but you can help me." I ran. I'm not proud of it, but I ran through those hallways as fast as I could. Behind me, I could hear Eleanor calling out, "Please don't leave me here. Please. My daughter is waiting." I made it to my car and drove away, but Eleanor's voice followed me for miles. Even now, months later, I sometimes hear her singing that lullaby late at night. I did some research afterward. Eleanor Morrison was a real patient at Hillcrest. She was admitted in 1944, 68 years ago, not 35. She died in the hospital in 1987, the same year that appeared on her nameplate. She'd been waiting to go home for 43 years when she died. Her daughter would be in her 80s now, if she's even still alive. Some patients, it seems, never accept their discharge.
Story 5. The emergency that never ended. My name is Chris, and I'm a paramedic. Part of my training involved learning about abandoned medical facilities in our area, so when my partner Tom suggested we check out Central Emergency Hospital, I thought it would be educational. The place had been shuttered for 5 years after budget cuts forced it to close. We went on a Friday night after our shift ended. It was late, around midnight, and the streets were quiet. Central Emergency was a smaller hospital, but it had been the primary trauma center for the county before it closed. We parked in the empty ambulance bay, where weeds were growing through cracks in the concrete. The automatic doors had been chained shut, but there was a maintenance entrance on the side that was unlocked. The emergency department was exactly what you'd expect. Gurneys overturned, medical supplies scattered everywhere, computer monitors dark and dusty. But what struck me was how recent everything looked. Like the staff had just left for the day and would be back tomorrow morning. Tom was examining an old EKG machine when we heard it. The unmistakable sound of an ambulance siren, getting closer and closer. We looked at each other, both thinking the same thing. Maybe there was an active call, maybe we should get out of there. But the siren stopped right outside the emergency bay. We heard the doors slam, voices shouting medical jargon, the sound of a gurney being wheeled quickly through the corridors. "We've got a GSW to the chest, male, mid-20s, lost a lot of blood. Get him to trauma bay 2 now. Where's the doctor? We need the doctor." The voices were getting closer. Tom and I hid behind an overturned desk, watching through the shadows as what should have been impossible unfolded before us. A gurney rolled past us, pushed by paramedics I couldn't quite make out. They were there, but they weren't solid. Like looking at people through thick fog. On the gurney was a young man, blood covering his chest, barely conscious. The entire emergency room came to life around us. Nurses appeared from nowhere, doctors rushed in from the hallway. Machines that had been dead for years suddenly started beeping and humming. The trauma bay lights blazed to life. We watched as this phantom medical team worked on their patient. I could hear every word, every instruction, every desperate attempt to save a life. As a paramedic, I recognized the procedures, the urgency, the way a trauma team functions under pressure. But this was all happening in a hospital that had been closed for years. The most disturbing part was that I recognized the procedure they were performing. Every paramedic in the county knew about the shooting at Central Emergency 5 years ago. A young man had been brought in with a gunshot wound to the chest. The trauma team had worked on him for hours, but he didn't make it. It was one of the last major cases before the hospital closed. "We're losing him," one of the phantom doctors said. "Come on, don't give up on us." The heart monitor showed a flat line. The long, steady beep that every medical professional dreads. Time of death, 12:47 a.m. Everything stopped. The machines went quiet, the lights dimmed, and the medical team simply faded away. The gurney sat empty in the trauma bay, a dark stain on the sheets where the patient had been. Tom grabbed my arm and whispered, "We need to leave." "No." We ran from that hospital, and I've never been back. But here's the thing that still haunts me. I looked up the details of that shooting from 5 years ago. The victim was brought in at 12:15 a.m. and was pronounced dead at 12:47 a.m., exactly the same time we witnessed. Some emergencies, it seems, replay forever. The medical team at Central Emergency is still trying to save a life they lost 5 years ago, and they'll probably keep trying until that building is finally torn down. Maybe even after that. These 5 explorers thought they were investigating empty buildings, but they discovered that some places hold on to more than just memories. They hold on to the people who died there, the tragedies that occurred within their walls, and the emotions that were too strong to simply fade away. Which story scared you the most? Comment below and subscribe for more true horror stories.